Staying with the courts, but to a very different story, and it's a tragic conclusion to a tragic story. South African mother Lauren Dickason was found guilty today of murdering her 3 young daughters in New Zealand in September 2021. While evidence was brought that she was suffering severe depression and may have been experiencing an episode of psychosis, ultimately she was found guilty of murder by the jury. Let's get an expert understanding of the impact of severe depression and postpartum depression. I'm joined now by specialist psychiatrist Dr Lavinia Lumu. Dr Lumu is the president-elect of the International Marseille Society for Perinatal Mental Health. Doctor, thank you so much for joining us this evening. It is such an incredibly heartbreaking story. And I know, obviously, because you haven't consulted with Mrs. Dickason, that you cannot give an expert opinion on her health, having not actually evaluated her. But it's interesting to note what her mum and dad have said. They were quoted as saying, "This was not our daughter, but a debilitating mental illness." From what the parents are saying, what conclusions do you draw in a more general sense?
All right. I think it's a really sad case because it just highlights that, although we have made advances in the treatment of mental illness, what we find is that during the postpartum period and during pregnancy itself, women in particular are really vulnerable. And I think what's sad with this case is that it highlights that, even though in the past people thought that mental illness does not exist, this highlights, the consequences of untreated mental illness. As I understand, she had stopped her medication so that she could get in move overseas and get the visa. And unfortunately, as a result of her suffering untreated, it resulted in this really sad outcome. So it's heartbreaking, and it highlights the different judicial systems, because in South Africa, we, in a case like this, it wouldn't be before a jury. We have slightly different avenues of how this would be addressed. For example, if someone is found to have committed a crime and they may have a mental illness, under the Criminal Procedure Act, Section 77, they get referred for a forensic psychiatric assessment where a number of different experts try and determine criminal responsibility, to try and establish mental state of the person at the time that they committed the crime. And they also look at fitness to stand trial. And at least on those grounds, if the person is found that the mental illness may have contributed to the crime, then they get diverted for psychiatric care.
It's interesting you mention the medication. Talk to me, I don't know what exact medication she was on for depression or postpartum depression, but what are the consequences of coming off medication? Can it put you into a period of psychosis? And if so, explain what postpartum psychosis is and psychosis in general.
All right, I think it's a really, really important question, because in the past, there wasn't a lot of research in terms of the effects of treatment, of psychiatric treatment in pregnant mothers. In the past, mothers' medication would be stopped. They'd have to suffer through pregnancy and suffer through the postpartum period. But we've got a body of evidence and a lot of international research that highlights that psychiatric medication is safe. Antidepressants are safe to be taken during pregnancy, and one should not stop their medication during pregnancy. One should not taper specifically antidepressants during pregnancy. It should be carried on, because we worry about the postpartum period. When the pregnancy hormones suddenly drop, mothers are extremely vulnerable for an exacerbation of their underlying psychiatric illness. And that opens the door to severe depression. And as we know, severe depression, if untreated, can progress to psychosis. And essentially, psychosis is a symptom of serious psychiatric illness, whereby a person loses touch with their reality, can manifest in various significant symptoms such as hallucinations and delusions. We also see psychosis in other mental disorders such as schizophrenia, bipolar, and even medical disorders such as a delirium. So it's actually quite serious having psychosis and would warrant immediate hospitalization and treatment. And I think this case just highlights that, we are in a state where we can safely treat mothers during pregnancy into the postpartum, have them home, well, healthy, able to look after their children. We can even carry on with breastfeeding with some of the medications. In actual fact, on the 5th of August, the Food and Drug Administration has released yet another drug in the treatment for postpartum depression, which is groundbreaking because it works really quickly within 14 days, which is groundbreaking and highlights the need for us to pay attention to mental illness and not allow stigma as a barrier to prevent people from accessing the care and the treatment that they need.
Talk to me about the importance of catching postnatal depression and depression in general early. It's something her parents flagged as well, saying we want to raise awareness. This needs to be caught early, because if it isn't caught early, it can progress to psychosis without treatment, or, as you've explained, if you come off your treatment. And how long can you legitimately say, well, this is clearly postpartum depression? I mean, can your child be 3, 4, 5, 6 years old and you're still suffering from postpartum depression?
I think that's a really important question because a lot of what we see in the postpartum, which is after delivery, a lot of the symptoms we see often have their onset during pregnancy. So you'll hear some people refer to it as peripartum, which means during pregnancy. So mothers maybe have symptoms already during pregnancy, and ideally we should be starting treatment from before, at conception, ensuring that mothers their well-being is taken care of and that their medication is optimized, and then not wait for the postpartum. By the time we reach the postpartum, it's often a little bit late, because that's the most vulnerable time, when the pregnancy hormones suddenly drop. And that's the highest risk for exacerbation of symptoms. And although the Food and Drug Administration has launched this new drug, the issue is currently the drugs that we do have available, the medications we have available, do take time to work, at least 2 to 4 weeks on average. So in an ideal world, we should be screening new mothers at antenatal clinics, of identifying high-risk mothers, and then those mothers then should be diverted for adequate care and treatment, ensuring that they have safe pregnancy, carrying on with their medication, so that we avoid this very sad and tragic consequence. And with regards to how long it goes on for, there are many mothers who suffer for years after they've given birth. And I mean, there's varying definitions in terms of how long does the postpartum go on for. Some people say the first 1,000 days are important, or up to when the baby's 2 years, but it can go on beyond that.
Wow.
Yeah. So I think that's important to highlight. Yeah.
You made a very important point at the beginning of the interview, and I think you were suggesting that really this shouldn't have been left up to a jury of lay people to make a decision. I mean, it was, first of all, it was extremely traumatic, apparently, for the jury to have to make this decision. They were crying and weeping, when the judgment had to be read out. But it is a very specialized situation, because ultimately what has to be decided is, has this woman become incapacitated in some way by a mental illness, or is she actually just a murderer? How do you tell the difference? Because some people would argue that anyone who wants to kill their children is clearly mad. But there are very clear differences, aren't there?
Oh, definitely. I think it just highlights how our judicial system works, wherein if we suspect that a person may have committed independently providing assessments and feedbacks. Then a report gets put together and provided to the courts. And it really assists the courts in determining whether, number one, there's criminal responsibility, whether the person is actually fit to stand trial. So I think, it is a pity that this happened in another country. I suppose in South Africa, maybe the course of action would have been slightly different. The outcome could be different. But unfortunately, we don't have all the facts of the case.
We don't. No, this is an important point to make. I want to ask about red flags, because one of the topics of discussion around this has been the fact that Lauren Dickason and her husband, both highly educated people, and the question then is, well, how do you you can't say you didn't know about postnatal depression, for example. But the truth is, it's very difficult to acknowledge that you have an issue, a mental health issue. But talk to me about the red flags, because I think a lot of people will be, how would I know if someone close to me is suffering to the point that they might harm themselves or someone else? Are there clear red flags, or can it be easy to miss?
Look, it's a very difficult question to answer, but essentially, I mean, it is normal after a mother gives birth for the first 2 weeks to feel a little bit moody, weepy, depressed, irritable, changes in sleep, appetite, and energy for the first 2 weeks as the body adjusts, and we refer to that as your baby blues. So essentially, it's a severe form of baby blues. So anything beyond 2 weeks postpartum is where we worry, and obviously, if a person is not able to return to their previous functioning, not, obviously aside from mood, not able to take care of themselves, the baby, these are all red flags to look out for. But I think in this case, I think the convicted was quite vulnerable in that she was probably hiding symptoms just to try and get into this other country too. So I think that made it very difficult. But essentially, I think this just highlights that, any new mother who has any untoward behavior, who is not themselves, and who doesn't have support, who is withdrawn socially, who may verbalize that they want to give up on life, suicide, those are the obvious red flags where she needs to be taken for an assessment, and that can be done by any healthcare worker and then referred for appropriately. And I think the biggest issue is the barriers. People are, because of stigma, people are afraid of what's going to happen. And that's why I think we have these really sad outcomes.
Yeah, and important to note, of course, that it doesn't matter what culture you come from. It can hit anyone at any time, and it's important not to feel shame and to be open to getting help. I want to thank you so much for really giving us such important information about the reality of mental health challenges for mothers, and much appreciate your insights this evening. Specialist psychiatrist Dr Lavinia Lumu. She's also president-elect of the International Marseille Society for Perinatal Mental Health. Still to come.